Previously on Shaping Opinion.
Well, the thing is, there had not been a similar type of problem. This really was the end of the innocence for U.S. and really international consumers. There had not been a breach of the public's kind of trust and safety like this.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined again by Dan Keeney for the second in a two-part series about the Tylenol crisis of 1982. Dan is a PR veteran and a crisis communications pro. In the first episode, we focused on the cyanide poisonings that left 7 people dead in Chicago. And not only that, in a larger sense, there was broken trust among consumers nationwide in the companies that provided them with their medicine. Today we're going to tell the story of the comeback and why this story is one that is still studied on campuses from Harvard to Stanford and throughout the PR business. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. 7 people are dead. We know they were poisoned. We know that it had to be from some form of tampering in the Chicago area at either the retail level or the distribution level, not at the manufacturing plant. And we know that the packaging had vulnerabilities. Now the company faces a huge crisis of trust. Dan, in our first episode, we talked about the drama of the first hours when no one knew what was happening, and they had to figure it out on the fly. Do you think that the company did enough? What do you think the company did right, and what do you think the company could have done better?
Well, I think that the relatively swift and definitive action they did remarkably. I mean, that's why we're still talking, why we are remarking on it. You say 30 years hence. I hesitate to criticize, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but there was a second round of poisonings 4 years later in 1986. It wasn't until after that Tylenol finally did away with capsules. So the reason people used to prefer capsules over tablets or traditional pills, what everybody knows today is that capsules went down easier. They had a gel-like outer exterior, and at the time, pills were not coated like they are today, so they were chalky and more difficult to swallow. And Tylenol capsules were fairly big and much easier to swallow if they're in capsule form. But that was a decision that was made. They updated the packaging. They basically invented tamper-proof packaging, a system of triple protection through which people would be able to detect whether or not somebody had already opened something. And it's something that we take for granted today, but was very much an invention back then. But the decision to put the capsules back on the shelf ended up being a deadly one. And so that would be the one area that I think that, and it isn't a public relations or a communications problem. It was an operational decision and an operational problem, but I think that's one that Tylenol, the folks at Johnson Johnson certainly probably regretted at the end of the day. From a communication standpoint, it's hard to pick nits because they did an awful lot right.
When we deal with crisis work, one of the first things we learn is that there's almost no line between operations and communications, because the decisions that you make in a crisis operationally become communications decisions. And the company now faces a huge crisis of trust. So the company briefly considered abandoning the Tylenol brand, but they decided against that pretty quickly. James Burke, the chairman of Johnson Johnson, decided they had to rebuild the brand. So he formed a team at McNeil to come up with new tamper-resistant packaging, as with the rest of the drug industry. And that's that operational point that you make. That becomes a communications decision when they decide to change the packaging, because that sends a message. Now we get into the communication aspect of it. Burke called in their oldest ad agency at Johnson Johnson, and that was Young and Rubicam. And Young and Rubicam began to poll consumers for their attitudes, and they started to learn some things about the impact that this crisis had on their reputation and the brand. One of the more amazing things that they learned from their surveys was that 94% of the people they surveyed were aware that Tylenol was involved in the poisonings. Now, today that would be sort of a yawner, because we know information gets out pretty quickly and most people come to conclusions very fast. But back in 1982, word did come through newspapers, and there was a time delay, and not everybody was tuned into the media, yet 94% of the people that they surveyed were aware that Tylenol was involved in the poisonings. And the good news for the company was that 87% of those that they surveyed realized that the company was not responsible for the deaths. But the bad news was 61% of those surveyed said they were still not likely to buy extra strength capsules in the future. And it got worse. 50% of the people they surveyed said that they wouldn't buy Tylenol tablets or capsules in the future. So what that meant to the bottom line was that even though consumers knew that it wasn't Tylenol's fault, these poisonings, they still weren't going to buy Tylenol in the future. But there was one silver lining data point, and that is what the company hung its comeback plan on. And that was that the frequent Tylenol users said they were more inclined to go back to the product than the infrequent user. So what the company decided to do then was concentrate any comeback effort on targeting those loyal customers of the past and bringing them back. Now, what would we do today, Dan? If this happened to us today and we have all the social media and digital tools we have, and you have to rebuild trust, I guess what would the obstacles be and what would the benefits be of what we have in front of us today?
Well, I think that we're a much more cynical society today. Number one, I would just say, let's just put what actually happened aside just for a second and kind of bring this into the second decade of the 21st century where we are. I think that you'd have the president tweeting. You would have Congress telling the chairman and or the CEO, you better get ready because we want to hear your testimony. You would have, which is happening with Mark Zuckerberg right now, you'd have the public asking, why in the world couldn't you have foreseen that this was a risk that you needed to protect us from before people died? Certainly back in 1982, the lawyers for the families that filed suit in the days following the deaths, they were suggesting that this was a foreseeable risk. Having these packages be so easily opened and then reclosed was something that anybody should have foreseen. So I think that today, that's where we begin to see a big schism between what we would do today and what we would be experiencing versus what was happening in 1982, because there was just kind of this underlying trust that was able to be maintained between Johnson & Johnson. I just do not think that would happen in today's environment. So what would we do? Yeah, the process of rebuilding that trust is, I always just encourage people to not be looking at the calendar because it just takes time. It is something that is not in any other way than by doing the incremental right things. A lot of times organizations, especially public organizations like Johnson & Johnson, they would be led to take quicker, easier decisions, and because of their chairman's kind of commitment to this, they were able to see it through. But that's often our biggest challenge as public relations counselors, is dealing with the impatience of the company managers who are being held to task day to day and don't necessarily see the accumulated progress that maybe we see in terms of where we are today versus a week ago and where we'll need to get a week from now in order to continue to kind of build step by step on the good feelings that we're able to begin to generate.
You know, one of the things that I thought was very ahead of their time on this was doing that consumer research, because that's one of the best things you can do in a situation that's not going away anytime soon. And to your point, sometimes senior management needs to see data to know how they're doing. And they're not going to trust necessarily what they see in the paper based on what they see in the paper or in the media or online. They need to see those numbers, and those numbers come in the form of analytics, in the form of survey results or polling results or focus group results. So that is something that a lot of companies may not do in the wake of a lot of crises that they really should consider if they want to see if they're in effect rebuilding that trust. That is what Johnson & Johnson had to do right away, and they recognized that. At the end of October, a month after the crisis started, the chairman, James Burke, mobilized Johnson & Johnson's subsidiaries. They wanted them to go out into the field and talk to doctors and pharmacists to begin recommending Tylenol tablets back to patients again.
You know, kind of a grassroots effort. Let's get out there. Let's get on the stump. Let's tell our story. And I'm sure, I would hope that they were also listening in the process, but getting out there and getting the word out, making sure this small segment was getting the story, because they can be evangelists on our behalf. You know, they're a very influential group, these medical professionals and doctors. We've always described that as the concentric circle model, right? The idea that you start with a highly influential and engaged, very probably small section of the public, and you then use their support. After you've won their support, you use that support to then extend to the next circle of influential people. And that's an excellent model for people to consider when trying to get their arms around a very highly complex issue like this.
So the company worked with FDA officials. After that grassroots effort that you mentioned, the company went to Washington. They worked with the FDA. At home, they introduced a new tamper-proof package, which included a foil seal and other features that made it obvious to any consumer that if there was any tampering, they could see it. These packaging protections soon became the industry standard for other medications, all over-the-counter medications. The company also introduced price reductions. They came up with a new version of their pill called a caplet. We now use the term caplet quite a bit, but at the time that was a new idea as a result of this crisis, and that was a tablet coated with a slick, easy-to-swallow gelatin, but far harder to tamper with than the older capsules. And when the company relaunched Tylenol capsules at the end of the year, it distributed 40 million discount coupons as a gesture to consumers for any losses they may have had if they threw their Tylenol away during the recall. By the following year, by the following September, Tylenol had already had a 30% market share, which was almost as high as their market share before the crisis started. So within a year after that, with an investment over $100 million, Tylenol's sales actually rebounded to their former strong position, and they became a leader once again in over-the-counter pain relievers. Now, one of the problems I have had over the years with the Tylenol case study, when I hear other public relations people comment on this, and actually when I see what other public relations people counsel companies, is that they make the knee-jerk assumption that the whole Tylenol case study was about taking responsibility even if you weren't at fault. They take it one step further, and they recommend to companies that they apologize, that they admit guilt even if they weren't guilty of anything. What do you think of that, Dan? Are there any errant lessons that people have taken from the Tylenol case study over the years?
Well, it's interesting because we're in the midst of one right now. The very first day that the Cambridge Analytica scandal at Facebook was disclosed, people were immediately comparing Facebook's response to this problem to the Tylenol case. And I couldn't help but kind of shrug, and I don't know if I laughed, but it's been completely misinterpreted if that's the case, because what is occurring at Facebook, it has very little resemblance to Tylenol. And because of the different environment that we're in, it's really hard to draw comparisons to what Tylenol. I've already described that, we were 4 days into this. The chairman and his executive team apparently enjoyed a nice restful weekend between experiencing the 7 deaths and then getting on an airplane and going to DC and dealing with the fallout. It's like, that is just, as we know from the BP disaster a decade ago, and the unfortunate words of the CEO of BP, I want my life back, right? That's just not possible today to think that the CEO is going to have that kind of time and personal life.
You mentioned the CEO. In this situation, James Burke, the chairman of Johnson Johnson, actually emerged a hero. He not only had his full weekend in between the middle of the crisis. You also you had mentioned the BP CEO who got into a lot of trouble during that spill where he said, "I want my life back." And he got in trouble just for that statement, not even having anything to do with the problem or the cleanup, just his statement. In this case, James Burke emerged as a hero. How would you describe that? Do you think James Burke was the hero in this situation?
You never know what's going on behind closed doors, right? It was interesting, if you go back to part 1, where you were kind of giving the blow-by-blow on how this all went down, David Collins, the CEO of McNeil, he was originally tasked with heading up this crisis. Now, at some point, that responsibility shifted to the chairman. And you don't know if that's because the chairman, I've never heard anybody question that. Why did that occur? Was the chairman unhappy with how Collins was dealing with it?
I never heard anyone question it, but what I did see in the tone of the coverage was they didn't so much see it as a vote of no confidence for Collins, but they saw it as Burke basically taking a buck stops here approach, that he was going to take personal responsibility for this and get involved. That's the way at least it was portrayed. But to your point, we don't know behind the scenes what happened.
For a lot of company executives that I've dealt with, they, especially at the very top of big organizations, big complex organizations, they have gotten to where they are through a great deal of control. And when they find themselves in a situation where there is no ability or little ability to control the situation, you just don't know what you don't know, especially in these first hours. It's really discomforting for them. That's uncomfortable. They prefer to go about the things they normally do. And so when you talk about this chairman being a hero, he's really a hero I think, for willing to operate outside of that comfort zone, for not just a willingness, really, a thirst for it. And that's really unusual for a person to kind of seize on that. I'd love to know if he's got a military background, because my sense is he must, because it's really a military mindset in my mind, and I mean that highly complimentary, with which he kind of took charge and led the whole organization with a very clear kind of mission in mind.
To recap, the perpetrators who caused these murders, and they are murders, was never found. Yet at the same time, there were major changes in the industry. Are there any lasting lessons that you would say that are still with us today, for better or worse, from the Tylenol poisonings?
Well, the lasting lessons are, it's probably a bit of paranoia is one of the lasting lessons, is you can't, it's best if you get there before the bad guys get there, right? I was making a point earlier that, well, why couldn't you have foreseen that this was a risk? You need to be able to anticipate the actions of bad actors before those actions are taken. And if you fail to, and bad actions are taken, then your position is going to be probably called into question. In today's environment, even as much of a hero as the CEO or the chairman of Johnson Johnson and the CEO of McNeil may have been in retrospect, they probably would not have been able to survive this scandal in today's era, where a head must roll, just as the head of BP rolled and the head of almost every major company that has experienced a major crisis over the last decade has rolled. It's not really survivable. And the lessons are that human beings are capable of doing terrible things, and you need to be able to foresee what or imagine what those terrible things are, hopefully prior to those things happening.
Dan Keeney, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a complete bio on our guest, Dan Keeney, and you'll get links to some articles on the Tylenol recall story. You can also listen to the first episode in this two-part series and other episodes as well. And don't miss our next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.